Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview. I'm François Picard with historian Gran Robb. Thanks for being with us. Your book, The Discovery of France, published in paperback by Picador, has just been translated into French, hence the fact that you're gracing us with your presence here. And it's always interesting to get, obviously, a foreigner's look on France. And for people who don't know France very well, they're always proud of being what they call coming from peasant heritage, peasant heritage. For us, peasant in the English language speaking world is a derogatory term.
Yeah.
But for the French, it's something to be proud of.
Yes, that's right. It's interesting, isn't it? And it's as though the French word has retained its origins, because a paysan is someone who belongs to a pays, which is a little, not a political unit, but a little recognizable part of the country. And pays comes from the Latin pagus, which was the word for an area controlled by a particular tribe, a Celtic tribe. And those tribal areas survived thousands of years, 2,000 years, and are still recognizable today. So paysan is someone who works the land, but who also has a very strong local cultural identity.
And do you find yourself, for instance, when the British grumble because the French get so much money from the common agricultural policy, do you find yourself having to explain why it is they get teary-eyed when they talk about agriculture subsidies?
Well, that's, the politics of that question is very difficult. But I remember I lived in Rouen in the time of Margaret Thatcher.
In Normandy.
Yes, and of course there was a lot of trouble at that time about the common market and money that was going to French peasants. But the French peasants I saw would demonstrate in the streets of Rouen, and at one moment burnt an effigy of Margaret Thatcher in the market square in Rouen where Joan of Arc was burnt.
Yeah, very much a two-way street then
yes.
when it comes to that misunderstanding. Why is it that the British don't have that kind of relationship with their rural origins?
In some parts they do. There is still a strong rural identity. But I think a lot of it is geographical. It's the fact the populations of France and Britain are more or less the same, but France has a land area almost twice the size of Britain. So you can, in France, be very isolated, very cut off from any kind of urban life. And you never really in England have that impression, or even in Scotland. Everything's much, much closer, the country's tighter. Whereas in France, you can get completely away from what looks like civilization.
Now, this past year, Italy celebrated its 150th anniversary. Germany is a recent phenomenon as a nation state onto its own. France, you get the feeling that it's been there, since the Middle Ages. Yet when you read your book, it begins with the anecdote of a mapmaker being assassinated, much in the same way that explorers would be in the Amazon if they ever started charting maps.
Exactly. This was in 1740. He belonged to the great expedition that went out to produce a map of the whole country for the very first time. And when he reached this very remote part of the southern Auvergne, he was seen as an invader. He was an outsider. He was an alien. He might have come from another planet. And he had these strange, complicated instruments that he was pointing at bare rocks and mountains. And so, in a very logical fashion, they killed him. He represented a danger or change of some kind. So it was a very heroic expedition. The country they were mapping was known to politicians and educated people in Paris as France. But in most parts of France, people didn't recognize that as their country.
And the slow process of nation-state building, you illustrated well how even the people, when they move to the capital to look for work, much in the same way that takes place today in the developing world, they go and live with their own. People from the Alps live with those from the Alps, those from Brittany with those from Brittany, etc.
Yes, migrant labourers would group together, usually from one village or a group of villages, and move to Paris along routes that probably hadn't changed since before the Romans. And when they reached Paris, as you say...
In fact, may I interrupt you? It may not even been repaired since the Romans when I read
Yes,
your
that's
book,
quite
especially
possible.
because it's epic getting to the capital.
Yes, yes. I mean, we talk about roads, but actually they were just itineraries of certain paths that you would follow that may be invisible to other people, a way through the forest, but the memory of them was passed down from generation to generation. And very often the road that had been built by the people in Paris would be unusable anyway, because it was used by carriages, which are very bad for roads and dig them up. So often they would be following invisible routes across country. And then when they reached Paris, they weren't there to go sightseeing, they were there to work. And they would create their own separate little colonies, never talk to anyone else, and the laws of their village and their own form of justice would apply in these little colonies, and they would only speak their own language, and then they would all go home again.
Why is there this French obsession with making everybody speak French, with making it one nation state?
I think precisely because it was a very difficult nation to create. It was very difficult to bring all these different peoples together. I mean, there are about 6 different language groups spoken in France alone, and very different cultures in different parts of France. So at the time of the Revolution, when they deliberately decided to create the French nation, even they didn't realize how difficult it was going to be. They didn't realize that when they passed a law, most of the population couldn't understand it because they couldn't read or speak French.
But it's a much more relaxed today, even today, a much more relaxed attitude. You see, in Britain, when Scotland votes for devolution, it's not that big a deal.
Yes.
Whereas in France, that would be impossible, the unthinkable.
I think it's partly because France was so severely centralized on Paris. Even before the revolution, there was a deliberate policy that every road that's built has to be headed for Paris. And that's why Paris looks like the heart of a distended body. You see maps of the road system as it develops. At the time of the Romans, Lyon was as important, if not more important. But everything is centered on Paris. And even today, it's very difficult to travel through France from north to south without going through Paris.
And in the book, you're far from the capital. They have a different relationship to each other. There's rivalries between rival villages. Even a different relationship, you might say, to animals. You keep the barnyard animals you describe in the book in the wintertime. Basically, in the stable is adjoining the house.
Yes, they effectively lived in the house because an animal was the most important thing an animal produced was manure, which makes it possible to grow crops on stony soil. But they're also a source of warmth. And also you have to remember that when you were completely cut off from the rest of the world, life could be extremely boring. And animals were very good company, and that's why people lived with them.
When you look at this, at what was not so long ago, just 3-4 generations ago, do you feel as though politicians in this country are perhaps a little bit out of touch with what goes on outside of the capital that you described a minute ago?
It's interesting that they make much more of an effort than British politicians to appear to be in touch. Because in France, it's not unusual to see a politician handling a goat or a sheep. Whereas in Britain, that would be very unusual. It's not considered anything important.
Sort of a case of the lady doth protesteth too loudly?
I think you have to show that you haven't lost touch with the basic realities, basic geographical realities of France.
And a final point, when you take a look at the battle for nation states that's taking place now in the Arab world, when you see in sub-Saharan Africa, several examples of it. What conclusion do you draw from seeing this France where they make such an effort to get everybody to speak the same language and to follow the path to the capital?
I think it shows that you can have a unified nation without forcing everyone to behave in the same way. In fact, that's more of a recipe for disaster. You have to recognize diversity and encourage people to be proud of their regions. In fact, that's what they did early on in the revolution. It, in the end, worked out it was quite successful, considering.
All right, Graham Robb. The book is called The Discovery of France, published in paperback by Picador. French historians, how have they reacted to the fact that it's been such a huge bestseller in the English-speaking world?
They're very courteous and open to other views, I think.
Okay, Graham Robb. The always diplomatic Graham Robb will say. Thank you for being with us, and thank you for joining us for the France 24 interview. Stay with us. More news to come here on France 24.